Well, today we continue our sermon series for Advent, As It Was Written, about the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. Now, so far we've looked at messianic typology in the Old Testament, those prominent figures like Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Moses and Joshua, who were types or figures of Jesus, who is the reality behind those images. And then last Sunday we looked at those extended passages of the Old Testament that are so descriptive and narrative they almost sound like you're reading out of the New Testament directly. I call those the four Old Testament Gospels: the Gospel of Moses, of David, of Solomon, and of Isaiah. We should not be all that surprised when we consider who authored the Scriptures, after all. They, as St. Augustine of Hippo said, the New Testament is in the Old concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New revealed. It was probably about 10 years ago that the website New Liturgical Movement drew attention to the ancient proclamation of the birth of Christ from the Roman Martyrology, which is chanted before the midnight Mass on Christmas. There's something very charming and thrilling about it. No wonder it's become quite popular. It centers the incarnation and the birth of Christ in human history, framing the event as a kind of timetable. It begins with creation and relates the birth of the Lord to the major events and the personages of sacred and secular history. I think most people say their favorite part of it is when they hear the mention of either Noah's flood or perhaps the mention of the 194th Olympiad. But my favorite line comes just before that. It situates the birth of Jesus, quote, in the 65th week according to the prophecy of Daniel. Do any of you have any idea what that's about? I would guess the answer would be no. And further, you probably couldn't find anyone who could tell you what this prophecy of Daniel even is. Until now, of course. I'm going to tell you what it's about. Of course, Daniel was a young prophet during the final days of the exile in Babylon. He foretold many broad world events and trends. He predicted the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greeks and the Roman empires, even at a time when the Babylonians seemed to be at their height and invincible. He accurately predicted the fates of the two kingdoms of Syria and Egypt between the fracturing of the Greek Empire and the conquest of the Roman, and the revolt of the Maccabees against Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, Daniel's astonishing accuracy in foretelling the future has led some scholars to tend to want to date the book of Daniel to after some of these events transpired. They are more comfortable with him having knowledge of the past than this kind of extensive knowledge of the future. Still, there's no hard evidence that deters us from the traditional dating of the book to the exile, about 530 BC. The date for Daniel's prophecy is the first year of King Darius, which would put it about 66 or 67 years after the Jews went into exile. He says that after studying the scriptures and the more recent prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, Daniel concludes that the Jews would return from the exile after a period of 70 years, which is to say the time was almost up to return. And he relates this in chapter 9 of his book and enters into a prayer for that restoration. He confesses the sin of the nation before God and he pleads for mercy. Then Daniel was visited by an angel named Gabriel. And Gabriel told him that he has come to give Daniel insight about the coming plan for God's kingdom and to give a timetable for the arrival of the Messiah and the Messiah's kingdom. Gabriel said, quote, 70 weeks of years are decreed concerning your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Now, the literal translation of weeks in this verse is sevens. That's how the Hebrews talked. So there will be 70 groups of 7, 70 times 7 years. That means 490 years are on the clock for the countdown. And when does the clock start ticking? Well, Gabriel said, "Know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem." So the 77s of years begins with some kind of decree involving the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Now we know that 4 such decrees were issued, one by Cyrus, one by Darius, and 2 by Artaxerxes. And those decrees date from a range of 538 to 444 BC. Daniel also told us that the 77s are divided into 3 separate units. There's 7 sevens, and then there's 62 sevens, and then there's one last 7. During the first time period, 49 years, Jerusalem would be built again. And then the second block of time, 62 sevens, a total of 434 years, followed that initial block for a total of 69 sevens, or 483 years. You got all that written down? Well, at this point, Daniel relates that, quote, "And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one," and that is Messiah or Christ, that's the word, "shall be cut off." And cut off was a euphemism for killed. And that's especially important, being mindful that, as you call the original purpose for the angelic decree of 77s was to atone for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now the groups of 7 and 62 weeks, making a consecutive period of 69 weeks, 483 years, are cited by the church fathers as beginning with the decree given to Ezra by Artaxerxes in 458 BC, and terminating with the baptism of Jesus. So that's the inauguration of his kingdom. Now, for those of you doing quick math, that puts Jesus' baptism at AD 25, which seems too early, until you remember that they got the calendar wrong, and that Jesus was actually born about 5 BC, making him 30 years old at his baptism and putting his birth in the middle of the 65th week, according to the prophecy of Daniel, as announced in the Christmas proclamation. In the Christmas proclamation, we have a dramatic timetable setting the birth of Jesus within the context of salvation history. But that could hardly compare to God's own timetable that he gave us in the Bible, in the book of the prophet Daniel. In fact, it was more than a timetable, it was a countdown. And when it ticked down to 0, 2 millennia ago, the world discovered that unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. By the way, that's from the Old Testament too. The New Testament is in the Old, concealed. The Old Testament is in the New, revealed. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.